All right, so now going live. It's just so weird. There's like a delay with setting up YouTube that you have to like hit the button after you've already started talking. Hopefully that works out, but we're live right now. So welcome everybody.
Hi everyone.
And I just want to, before we actually get into this, I will be having an interview with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy on this channel in, I guess, 3 hours or so. So yeah, I don't know. It'll be up here on this channel as well, so that we can go into that. We're going to be discussing a bit of like his recent debate with Destiny and some of the other stuff he's been doing on his channel. But today we're going to be discussing the 14th lecture from John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis: Epicureans, Cynics, and Stoics. Pod, do you want to like go into some of, I guess, like the overall aspect to the lecture itself?
Sure. So this episode, a lot of it was sort of historical, where he was going through, talking about a lot of what came after the what he calls the axial period with like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. So he starts with sort of Alexander the Great and how this changed the world, and it opened up the world. Prior to Alexander the Great, people in the West lived in these small communities, polises, where you grew up with everyone you knew. You were involved in your government. You knew the people. You probably knew personally the people making the decisions, and that was so your agency relationship. Your
agent arena relationship. Yeah.
Yes, agent arena relationship was very tight. With Alexander the Great, suddenly the world is opened up, and suddenly people are moving around. They're going miles and miles away from where they were born, and he thinks that this brought on a sort of a crisis of meaning, where suddenly they didn't know their place. And so philosophers in that time really moved to trying to cause this, to solve the problem of suffering, where sort of philosophers were like the early psychologists of the day. And so the focus of this episode is the Hellenistic philosophers. He talked about the Epicureans, the Cynics, and then he's moving into really talking about the Stoics, who he describes as the real ancestors of modern day psychology. So the Epicureans had their main focus was on fear. That they thought that the main problem with society, the diagnosis for the problems of society, is fear and anxiety, and in particular anxiety about death. So he goes into the difference between anxiety and fear. So fear is when you have an observed threat. So you see a snake in the grass, you see the snake, you know what to do, you kill the snake or run away, and that's fear. Anxiety is more nebulous. You're not quite sure what the threat is. And you don't know what to do. So that not knowing what to do is what causes the existential dread that people...
Kind of like having this unknown thing that could or could not be a threat. You don't know, but because it's not resolved into some sort of coherent thing, it's I guess, I don't know, worse in some way, because it doesn't give you any actionable method of dealing with it.
Right, and he says the Epicureans would say we suffer because we can't manage our anxiety. So they talk about we don't control our imagination and our thinking, and so we suffer from anxieties that cripple our ability to get a grip on the world, and that's sort of, again, today I think we see remnants of that in we talk about rumination, and a lot of anxiety and depression. People who have that, they don't have control over their thoughts, and they can think about negative thoughts quite a bit. So the Epicureans were dealing with trying to control that, and their solution was, rather than dread mortality, their death, radically accept their death. And he goes through, it's interesting, he goes through how they come to that conclusion. Now, I think one of the key findings of the Epicureans was to focus on that which is meaningful. So be attached to that which is meaningful, and not attached to those things that aren't. And so the Epicureans settled on friendship and meaningful relationships as the key to a good life, and ideally in those communities to pursue wisdom and transcendence. Now, Vervaeke says they were sort of onto something, but he thinks they really missed. They were onto something with fear and anxiety, but he doesn't think the fear of death is really the key. And he moves on to the Cynics with Diogenes, who
I liked how he brought in how Diogenes was shared in ways to Socrates, where Socrates was kind of like putting people through this rigorous testing of their ideas to see just how much they actually knew. And Diogenes is kind of in a similar way to that, rather than doing it completely verbally, but actually in a more confrontational, like objective manner, or I don't know, way out there kind of manner of really challenging the cultural kind of ideas and the norms of the time. Like there's this story of Diogenes where he just goes out into the public place and publicly masturbates. And when asked like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? He says something like, if my stomach was able to be filled just by rubbing it, then I would certainly do that all the time as well, or something like that. But yeah, and Vervaeke brings up how there's kind of these two differences that can be pointed out, where there's like, you can have guilt or you can have shame regarding your actions. And for shame, that's more to do with the social component of, like, you live within a cultural context and there are things that you do that break the cultural norms that are kind of taboo and things like that. And bringing it back to I guess Socrates and Plato, I think that was kind of, he draws this analogy, or it was the analogy I think of Plato, where we have an aspect of man and beast and lion within all of us, and lion has to do with like the social component. So like there's a component to yourself that is acting in response to the rest of the other people around you. So you're doing things for honor, and you're not doing things because of shame. These are the social and cultural kind of, I don't know, barriers or guidance systems on you. But and then he draws in the difference between the things that we do that elicit shame and the things that we do that elicit guilt. Whereas guilt might not even have to do with how your cultural context or social context responds to what you've done, but it could be more associated with like your own internal conscience.
Well, yeah, he relates guilt is distress at having broken a moral principle, and shame is distress at having broken a cultural purity code.
Right.
So you'll feel shame at having, he gives the example, if he feels shame at having, if your pants fall down in the middle of a lecture, but it's not guilt. He didn't do anything morally wrong. So yeah, the Cynics divided between moral principles, which they would, I think, say were objective, and cultural principles, which were set to change.
Right.
And Cynics took this to a radical extent, where they said, they took the Epicureans, where they say focus on what's meaningful, and what they came to the conclusion is what's meaningful is that which doesn't change. So natural law, we don't, so cultures change, so we should eschew anything to do with culture. So any man-made concepts we should live without. So Diogenes would live in a barrel, or a tub,
like a dog. Diogenes the dog.
Yeah. And so they were just focused on pure morality. Or Alexander the Great apparently in a story came to him and said, I can make you rich and famous and all that, and what do you want from me? And Diogenes just said, hey, sorry, can you move over? You're blocking my light. Because because their thing is, because these man-made, non-natural things are impermanent, when they inevitably go away, that will cause suffering. And so if we want to avoid suffering, we have to focus only on things that are permanent,
Right.
which again has problems, I think, which is where I think he ends the lecture by sort of hinting at the Stoics, who say, well, yeah, you want to focus on the permanent things, but even though cultures change, social dynamics is permanent. We always have to work within a culture, and I think that's what he's going
Right.
on in the next
And
lecture.
you could even see that, like, if you wanted to look at like how, like, even if you were to live as a dog, like dogs themselves have their social hierarchy that they have within. They're not just like these lone wolves that live out in a barrel all by themselves. That when dogs are in the wild, like according to, I guess, natural law, there is the hierarchical organization to their like dog society in a way that it I don't know. I guess you could fault Diogenes for not being enough of a natural law theorist in some sense.
Well, it's like they take a good idea, but anytime you take an idea and you take it to the extreme, you're likely probably missing something. Like something can be good in moderation, but when you take it to an extreme, it's it's not gonna it's gonna work as cross purposes.
I do like the idea though of like, okay, there's all these things that are changing to the point like fashion. Like you could do one thing and it works just fine, but the next, I don't know, year that's suddenly out of fashion and now like you look like an idiot. But and like if you're trying to please the crowd for all of these different things, you're always going to be on the back step. Like you're always going to be making these errors, and that you're going to have to kind of be putting so much stress into things that are ultimately not going to be like meaningful for anything past a year. Like you're going to put in a whole lot of practice to something that's just going to become useless, especially like if you're in a location that is going through plenty of different regime changes. If you focus too much on one regime's rule set and then they get killed and the next guy that comes up like is going to kill everyone who followed in that past guy's idea set, then you're just going to be one of the same people that gets killed with the rest of them. But if you instead focus on like, okay, what are the principles that don't actually change? What are the things that you have to live by and are actually like proven themselves valid even amongst all these, like even in a dynamic, constantly changing social space, these things will hold true irregardless. You've and also like putting into practice like want not, or how's the term go? It's like waste not, want not. It's like if you only want the things that you, well, I guess that's kind of the interesting thing about the Cynics is that they like disregard all sort of ideas of like material wants, things like that. Like there's a story of Diogenes where like all he had to his name was like this bowl that he used to drink water from, and then he saw some small peasant boy using his hands to drink water from the pool, and then he like realized how vain he was being for actually having a material possession that he didn't even need, and so he like smashed the pot and then went directly into do these things to drink water from, and so it's so fascinating to see like the aspect of like completely disregarding all material possessions and wants and seeing how far you can actually live with like such a high sense of scarcity and still being able to live a at least somewhat productive life. I mean, enough that we're talking about him, what, thousands of years later.
But that's the thing, because like I get the idea of wanting to avoid suffering, and that's important. But if you're just going to avoid things because they will eventually disappoint you, you're also giving up. It's not just suffering. I mean, there may be suffering at the end. Maybe eventually they'll disappoint you, but you get some benefit, you get some joy, you get some experience. You've experienced some things in the meantime. For example, if most people don't date the first person they marry, you know that when you start a relationship, most likely you're going to break up. Every once in a while, you get one that lasts. But so if we took that kind of argument, you say, well, since I know I'm eventually going to have my heart broken, I'm just not going to get into this relationship. Except yes, my heart gets broken at the end, but I have had months or years of joy from it. So it's not you have to, I think, take that into account in the formula, and it's not, and I think maybe the point to take from it is not don't care about these things, but don't care too much about these things. Don't attach your entire identity. Don't attach everything to it. Leave yourself open to, just reduce your attachment. Enjoy it without being too attached to it.
Yeah, that's a good, like, you mentioned identity, and so that's a good way to kind of bring in back Vervaeke's agent arena relationship. So, like, if you think about, like, drawing your identity upon, like, okay, I am X's boyfriend. That is who I am as an identity. Like, that's who I am. And then, like, I don't know, she cheats on you or something like that. That kind of, like, crumbles your entire identity, leaving you to kind of suffer. So maybe there's a way in which, like, you can enjoy the small things, like you can enjoy the temporal existence that you have, like the here and the now. But if you build your entire identity off of that, then it makes it so that you cannot, like, go past that. Like, if your entire identity is built upon your relationship with somebody else, and then they die or they cheat on you or something like that, then, like, that almost, like, puts you into a position of, like, this identity of who I have adopted needs to be killed off, either literally but through suicide, or figuratively by adopting some new identity that is able to extend past that.
Oh, and I see. So Alexander Zapata is watching. Thank you, Alexander. And he said, I think Diogenes means to play for himself, not interested in impressing tripe. And yeah, I think the way, I haven't read him in detail, the way Vervaeke described it is, his, like, I think he did want to impress people, honestly. Like, he was out there trying to influence people all the time. He just wanted to impress them in the right way. His idea was to, so Vervaeke talks a lot about these disruptive psychotechnologies, that the goal of all these technologies is to help you become wise, to help you have a better grip on the world. Now, Diogenes' approach was confrontation. He wanted to shock you out of your normal reactions, your cultural norms, like your normal comfort level, and force you, by shocking you, to face, these big questions. So I don't think he was, from what I described, I don't think he was just like, oh, the best life is just going off on your own. He wasn't a hermit.
He was kind of like Socrates in a way, where he's like involving himself with the people. Like, there's a story of, like, I think Plato in developing his school created a definition of man of, like, a flightless bipedal avian or something, or a flightless bipedal animal, and then Diogenes plucks a chicken and raises, like, behold Plato's man, or something like that, just to, like, it's very much like, okay, they're kind of like trying to build up something, and then he's, like, there to just kind of smash it to pieces, just to show that, like, there's more to it, that, like, we can't just create our little substructures to build up everything and then, like, work off of that. I like that there's people like Nietzsche or Diogenes that are there that to kind of smash the ideas that we have, that just so that, I don't know, it gives us more that we have to kind of work on.
Well, that's right. Like Alexander, you said right, but not tripe. But I agree. But I think my problem with him a little bit is that I think he thought he was a little too broad with what he considered trite. But I think, John, you're right. I think having extremists like him are useful, because even though I wouldn't want to do what he does, the fact that there's someone out there who can bring these ideas in this confrontational way without trying to be cruel, like he's trying to change it sounds like he's not, like, going out there and beating people. He's just trying to mix you up,
he's like trying to offend their senses and sensibilities in a lot of ways too, like, just to kind of really throw them for a loop, and it's
And I think we can take some of that, which is to say, we can take the more rational, I think, more reasonable and moderate conclusion of, okay, well, we should stop and think about the cultural norms we follow. We should stop and think about, and we actually, you mentioned Destiny, and we were talking earlier about Destiny. Destiny, for example, has a lot of people are, I think, take advantage of this, but he has a thought experiment, or he likes to talk about why incest is wrong. And it's not that he doesn't think incest is wrong, but his opinion is most people have no idea why they think incest is wrong. They just have this gut instinct, the ooh that Vervaeke talks about. That when Vervaeke talks about, if I just take a drink of water and drink it, mix it in my mouth and swallow, no one has a problem with it. But if I got all the spit in my mouth and hawked into the cup, swirled it around and drank it, everyone would be like, ooh. But they're really the same thing when you break it down. It's water mixing with my saliva and going into my stomach. But the cultural norm is we don't spit things out. And the same with incest. I think there are arguments against incest, but for most people, their argument against incest is they have an instinctive ooh about it because it violates a cultural norm. And a lot of people can't, if you push them, they really can't explain because they haven't thought about it beyond ooh. And that's what I think Diogenes teaches us. I think that okay, have the ooh, but then analyze it. Why do I feel this disgust? And as Vervaeke talks about, we have this with homosexuality. I'm very open to all sexualities, but I admit, like, I grew up in a closed society about that, and I know, especially early on, I don't think these days I have that so much. But when I was younger, I remember being disgusted at the idea of two men kissing or seeing that. Like, it did have an instinctual reaction. I think over the years, I don't have that. I've shirked that, but it wasn't a thought of reaction. It was an instinctive reaction based on cultural norms at the time.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's like a lot of what Jonathan Haidt's work in regards to moral foundations theory is, that like the theory is that like all of our moral intuitions are based, all of our moral positions are based upon these kinds of intuitions for which we might like have a postulate for the reasons behind it, but even when the reasons get kind of challenged, that doesn't like disregard, it doesn't suddenly make the position no longer immoral. So like he actually has the example of incest, or actually he has this other example of, say,
okay, Destiny or
no, Jonathan Haidt. Yeah, Jonathan Haidt. Okay. So yeah, he refers to it as morally dumbfounding, where okay, so here's a like, why is it wrong for a man and his sister to have sex? Like, and they'll say, oh, because of the genetic defects that it could have on the child. It's like, okay, well, imagine that they're using two forms of protection. Is it still wrong for them to have sex? And like, well, maybe.
Or the imagine, like, we don't say, what if somebody has a genetic, what if they have a genetic, we can now test for these. If you have a genetic marker where if you have a baby, there's a reasonably high chance that they'll inherit this genetic marker that's it's Down syndrome or something. We don't typically say, hey, you're forbidden. We don't forbid Down syndrome people from having babies, even though they may have a higher chance of passing on those genes. Or if two people, have these rare conditions, we don't in any other situation say you're not allowed to have a child together.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of the thing, is like we have these moral intuitions regarding things that it's not like suddenly change, like, okay, I present like, okay, so yeah, it is like, I think about, a brother and sister having sexual relations, that's not right. It shouldn't happen. And then like we give a reason for that, and then when that reason is kind of rebutted in some sense, that doesn't like suddenly disregard our disgust or our feeling of, no, that's wrong.
Right. Just even understanding the intellectual doesn't necessarily automatically change your instinctual, culturally devised reaction.
Mm. Yeah. So, and I don't know, this raises in a lot broader conversation about like the origins of morality and what they are. That whereas like from I guess the Jonathan Haidt perspective, it is very much entirely tied within our cultural, I guess, construction in a lot of sense. Like he's somewhat of a like. I don't know. There's
entirely
a lot.
like the Cynics would disagree. The Cynic would divide it between there's the cultural norms and then there's morality, which they would say are different, but that people confuse the two. So it's not that morality is necessarily always tied. It's that often people mix up. So I have an instinctive disgust for, people have a instinctive disgust for homosexuality. Therefore, it must be wrong, and that is not a rational position to take. Your feeling of disgust does not in itself make it wrong. Now, there can be times where your feeling of disgust, is, in concordance with what's immoral as well. But it's just like Alexander said, I think the essence of it is that to challenge one's views that are assumed rather than those that are thoughtful, just making you think. Yes, like he's saying, stop and think about why are you having this reaction. And I can remember as a kid having that disgust reaction to homosexualities. But today, when I see two men kissing, I don't think I do. I'm just trying to think back, but I don't think I do have that. So you actually can, I think, by thinking it through and by thinking through rationally, I think you can eventually change. It took a long time. I think there was a big difference between the time where I became okay with homosexuality and the time where I didn't feel that sense of disgust. And even now, like I like where I say I don't think there's anything wrong with it, I would still probably have an aversion to somebody, say, knowing I did something like that, like, right? And that's, again, not rational, I think, in my view. And I know you, I don't know what your position is. We've never talked about homosexuality, so I don't know.
Well, I think it's kind of fun, interesting, because like drawing from those two things, there's the cultural kind of like societal expectations and standards, and then there's also the moral kind of like this is what the Cynics or Vervaeke brings up with the Cynics is there's the fault, like what is the term he uses, a particular term, it's like set your heart on what won't get broken, or
right. Yeah, that's exactly it. Set your heart on what won't get broken.
Yeah, do not set your heart on things which will end, only on like natural laws or patterns that won't disappear, like the eternal aspects of nature. And there is the other like component, like in trying to draw upon a universal ethic or like natural law, that there's the way in which a lot of like the philosophers have looked to what has lasted within nature, or what is the function of these things in nature. So like the function of the tongue is to taste and to help you swallow and speak. And these are the components or the capacities of the tongue, bringing in kind of Aristotle's usage. And like the capacity of the ear, the function of the ear is to hear with. And so like there's the other aspect of arguing, like at least for the time or other times, against homosexuality within the framework of natural law, whereas there's a function to the sexual organ is to procreate, and then to use such an organ not in regards to that function is similar to, like, say, overeat to the point of vomiting or something like that, where it's a misuse of the function to your organs, and that's at least a way in which these other aspects of morality have been considered, at least.
Right, but of course, I'll say on that one, for example. First, we tend to call it the naturalistic fallacy these days, but I would say, like, for example, the prostate apparently, can, when you stimulate the prostate, it can result in you can have a type of orgasm. So you might say, well, why was it placed there just in the right position for a penis entering to stimulate it? Well, maybe so. If you're going with that argument, I'm just saying, you could argue Well, that must be
the function of the prostate is to be. Yeah, so that would be interesting. Like all straight men are like there's a natural law guiding them to like they have to have gay sex.
No. Like first of all, I would think the natural part of it is I don't think we pick our attraction. That we, I don't think anyone chooses who they're attracted to. Like I don't look at somebody and say I am now going to be attracted to that person. I look at a person and I have a feeling. Like I don't, not a deliberate feeling, and then I realize I'm attracted to that person. But I'm just talking in terms of if we're looking at the function, the body function. There's an argument that we could say the prostate, part of that body function is it's way deep in there, so it's not something that's easy to stimulate. That it gets stimulated and has a very distinct reaction.
So if the like the purpose or the function of that prostate is to elicit pleasure when stimulated.
Or one of the purposes. Yeah, one of the purposes.
Yeah, one of the and that's the thing too. Like there's a lot of things that are multifunctional. So like you can like the tongue has multi uses where it can be used to eat or to speak. But if you were to use the tongue in such a way that it damages its ability to perform its other functions, so like if you eat glue or something, I don't know, that would damage your ability for one to be able to continue eating, but also damage your ability to speak. And I don't know if you use your ears to say like listen to rock music at an extremely high volume, that damages your ability to continue to listen to music further into your future.
Sure, no, I get what you're saying, but you have to admit there's a very strange, and again, remember, I'm not a theist, so I don't accept this argument in itself. So I'm not making the argument the prostate was designed for this specific purpose. I'm saying that if we accept the argument that we have to look at the function, the primary function, and anything else is quote unquote immoral, well, then we could apply that analysis to the prostate and say it's very odd that it would be designed to cause an orgasm that literally shoots out of your penis if and that wasn't part of its purpose. Like, why would something like that be placed there? It seems odd from a design perspective. It seems designed specifically for this, and in conjunction with the fact that a certain percentage of the population finds themselves through no control of their own attracted to members of the same sex. You would say that to me, if we're going on this naturalistic argument, that to me suggests that homosexuality is natural. And of course, you can look; it's in the animal kingdom as well. I mean, we don't want to. We have some more comments. So in a second, let's look at some of the comments.
And I don't know how far I actually buy this, but I think there's a certain degree of like homosexuality tied to the environmental components to it. So like in the past, like you have a ship and all you have are male crewmen there. There's kind of the component where like, I don't know, in order to relieve, I guess, sexual stress, there's the ability to do so.
They had some fun with each other.
Yeah. What's
the ladies?
Yeah, what's the term from in prison, like gay for the stay or something like that?
Sure. No, but I agree with that. But and this actually links to something that Alexander said, where he says, I believe homosexuality can be instructed. So although I don't care if gays are gays, I care if they pretend to preach it like it was an ideology that can be adopted. Spreads misery as far as I can see. Now, this goes on what you were saying. Listen, I can use another man as sort of a masturbatory,
in fact, that's how in the Hellenistic days, that's exactly what.
Right. So that's the guys on the ship. The guys on the ship or the guys in prison are, listen, I want to get off and I'm going to use another guy to do it. But that's not really, that's, I guess, a homosexual practice, but it's not really being a homosexuality. Being a homosexual, your sexuality is who you are attracted to. And that I don't think we can control. Right. I don't think, so I can say, I'm straight, I'm not attracted to men, but I'm going to go have sex with a man because I want to have that experience. That would not make me a homosexual. I could never have had sex with a man, but every time I see a man, I'm attracted to them. that would make me a homosexual.
Right. And in fact, the term homosexual is kind of a recent inclusion to actually identifying according to your preferences or like your feelings is kind of a recent addition to the discussion, because like previously it was all in regards to the act itself of sodomy, like, and that is what it had been considered immoral, is the act of sodomy, whereas like the component of like what you're attracted to is kind of irregardless to the moral nature of it, because that's kind of the thing, like you're only responsible for what you act upon, not how you feel about things, because you can't control what you feel about things, but you can, at least to some degree, control your actions.
Sure. And I know that's the standard for a lot of Christians, that, you know, it's not the being attracted that they are against, you know. I mean, I have issues with that. So I get that. But I think if we're going to use this naturalistic and what's natural, then we have to, I think it's hard to come to the conclusion that attraction is not natural. And like listen, I'm not attracted to every woman out there. There are certain women I'm attracted to and certain women I'm not. And I don't get to choose that at all. Like, so, you know, if that's not a choice, we've evolved to have, and it probably makes sense, we've evolved to have attractions to certain types of people, because if everyone's attracted to just one person, then there probably wouldn't be enough babies. So we all have different types, which spreads out our attraction through the
and that may even be, I guess, if you want to look at it from a functionalist approach, like there are always going to be a lot more women that are, or wait, no, there's always going to be a lot more men that are unable to spread their genes further across time than women. It's something like, I don't understand the statistic exactly, but it's like one, I don't know, it's something along the lines of like more women will have their choice of man than man will have their choice of women, something like that. And so like if it could be that homosexuality is kind of like an adaptation to scarcity of genetic resources across time. So where
it could be like I know it's throughout the animal kingdom. So I mean, it's been around since, like, if again we're accepting evolution, it's been around for a very long time, well before there were humans. It's found throughout. It's always
right. And that's the other thing about evolution too, that kind of pokes some holes in the idea of natural law. Because
the morality of natural law, you mean?
Right, because with the kind of acceptance of the Darwinian theory, is all functions that we see are derivative of a primary function of genetic fitness, where like your tongue certainly has the capacity to eat and to speak and things like that, but these are all lower order functions of your ability to, say, attract mates through the use of language, or to eat food that allow you to burn calories and to spread your genetic seed. Like if we're kind of using the natural law theory, like all tied with Darwinism, all adaptations or functions to an organ are components to the broader function of spreading its genetic code.
Yeah, and I think we also have to be very careful. Like, I don't think most people who believe in the theory of evolution don't say, well, because we evolved this, that makes it moral. Like that's a fallacious thought. We evolved intelligence, which lets us go beyond just pure bodily functions and allows us to think about these things to make them even better. And that's where we get, because, you know, animals aren't really concerned as much with ethics, so there's some ethics even in animals. And sorry, just welcome CM Bradley.
Hey Cody.
Who John knows, and he says dispositions are also a matter of ethical responsibility, since they are shaped by habits of thought and pattern. Not all dispositions can be completely changed, but we have a degree of moral responsibility in the shaping of our desires. I mean,
yeah, I agree with that. Like, one of the discussions that we've had on this channel was just ordinary men that was part of Jordan Peterson's book club and recommendations. And in it, it kind of tracks the Police Battalion 101 and their I guess their greater ease in being able to commit atrocious acts against the Polish and the Jews during World War II. And it's fascinating to see, like, starting off, they were completely opposed to it and like vomiting and running away and trying to do the best they can to keep from perpetrating these acts on these innocent people. But by like the third expedition, they were becoming like efficient at it. They were good at their jobs, and it's like I do think like there's a strong aspect to being human where we adapt to our situations and our circumstances that are kind of outside of our control. Like when put into situations like the Police Battalion 101, you become accepting of your, or maybe it's like a removal of this sense of guilt over time for you.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's also what you've described is just the other side of the coin. Our lack of a sense of ooh should not be confused with considering this action as moral.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that's the real point that Diogenes that we take from it, which is whether you have disgust or whether you just feel good about it.
Yeah.
You shouldn't let your feeling about it determine whether it's ethical or not. You have to analyze it, and that's a conscious decision. Our gut reactions are unconscious, and that's why, you know, I think our gut reactions like are a good first guide. Like if I have an ooh reaction to it, it is something that should tell me, oh, you know what, I should look at this.
Yeah.
You know, and
it could be like an indicator from your ancient ancestors past. Like we have this positive experience from eating high calorie, like sugary things. And this is something like, yes, this is like, if we were to go completely off of instinct, we would assume that anything that's sugary is the best thing that we could be eating. But of course, like we've evolved from circumstances in which we didn't have high access to highly sugary foods. So whenever we did have access to them, we should have utilized them. But now we're in such a different circumstance from what we've evolved to that we kind of have to update our moral or update our instinctive responses to the things that we interact with, to something that it better fits what we know to be true rationally.
And so I think, yeah, like these good feelings or bad feelings are more an indication of whether we're in accordance with the cultural norms. But and they could be like, the cultural norms could be ethical or not, but what you need to do is go out of your way to analyze it. I mean, with eating food, like, I don't know if you would say eating bad food is unethical. I would just say it's sort of bad for me, but I wouldn't say it's immoral in that sense. Like, you know,
well, you can kind of consider it like, okay, say you have a family and you have a responsibility for your taking care of your family. And if you say only eat hamburgers every single day of your life, you're like putting your body into a much, or even like, you're putting your body into a worse position of being able to care for your family. And so like there's certain ways in which our like it's like secondarily related to morality.
I agree that I agree with that. Like, and like you can say you do have, I think, a responsibility to try to be, you know, healthy, to stick around as much for your family as you can. Now, I think we have to be a little careful with those where, like, I mean, you can see by my face, you know, I overeat, and so I haven't done a good job of this, but I would put it in a different, I guess, category of ethical wrong. Like, okay, it's more, I'm not doing as optimal a job. Like I'm putting myself at risk for whatever. And so I should be doing a better job, but it's not the same thing as like stealing from somebody. I think it's a different class of moral wrong, or maybe it's not.
It's also like very much tied to like, what are the circumstances that you're currently involved in? And like we're living in a time where you don't have to keep perfect fitness in order to protect your family. Something like you're able to do that just as viably now that you wouldn't have that same abilities like thousands of years ago. And so yeah, it's yeah. I don't know.
So,
We kind of went off on a tangent there.
Well, no, but this is all good. But
Yeah,
Alexander said, "I guess we can shape our dispositions, but comes from one's character to do so. Be disciplined." And I think that's right too. I think what the lesson from Diogenes is to just think about why we are shaping this or that disposition. That it has to be a conscious thing. That we shouldn't just assume. We shouldn't just assume that our cultural reactions match up with morality, and that's where we come to, like, for example, homosexuality. I would say, for example, without the argument from sort of a God, from a religious text, it's hard to come up with a moral argument against homosexuality. I mean, a religious Christian would say, well, we do have that prohibition, but that didn't exist, I guess, in Diogenes' time. I think he was he was pre-Christian, right? Yeah.
Diogenes? No, Diogenes was the cynic.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It was pre-Christianity.
He was pre-Christian. So we do have to think about these things. I mean, that's why do we consider something immoral? And it gets trickier when you bring in religious texts, people who accept that as the reason. But that makes it harder. Sumit, did you?
One thing I wanted to. One thing I've been wondering with your discussion, you've been touching some really difficult topics, and Diogenes could do this in a very long time back, and somehow you know what I mean. I just wanted to bring up the point about how these days in public, if you say certain things, they ban you and everything. So it's interesting that that part has not. Maybe this Dionys guy had it better.
Social media has changed.
Yeah.
Changed
well, there's also the sense in which we're kind of benefited by having such a small audience, where we're able to, like, one of our book discussions that we had was The Natural History of Rape, which actually looks at what leads to rape as an instinctive drive from an evolutionary perspective. And so there's kind of
but we can say, listen, yes, there may be an evolutionary advantage to rape, but it's wrong ethically, and because it's not the same thing. Anyone who argues, I think the naturalistic argument is wrong. That to say that just because something is natural makes it moral is fallacious. I mean, there are. I mean, listen, some natures, the female devours the male after having sex. I mean. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a model to follow? I don't think we want to follow that model. Like, there's a lot of really horrific stuff that happens in nature, and the dog living like a dog out in the wilderness is miserable, I think, most of the time. Like, they're cold. They're always looking for their next meal. They're always afraid of being eaten themselves. Just assuming that, state of nature means happy and fulfilled, I think is not
right. And it's kind of interesting because, like, that idea of the naturalistic fallacy is a somewhat modern invention. It's from G.E. Moore, who was an who's like I guess not ethical non-naturalist, but normative non-naturalist, where he didn't think that, like, we could ever put any sort of, like, concise definition upon what is the good. Like, anything that you might try to do that for, the good is whatever whatever is genetically successful. Like, that might be your definition of good, but that there's, like, always going to be some sort of, like, limit to that in a somewhat similar way to Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and I think there's some sort of connection there with that. But I
was thinking about this. I had a very similar thought early this week about Gödel and how it may apply to this kind of thing as well. So we're on the same wavelength there.
It's interesting because, like, I mean, as a naturalist, it sort of raises up some like hard ways to respond to this, where like, okay, all there is natural, but we cannot use natural reasonings to justify our moral actions or immoral actions or think like it. At least for G.E. Moore, the normative claims are non-naturally based, and I know there's certain like arguments like for theism that are directly due to this. I think it's called the axiological argument, where like if we were to be using nature to prescribe our morality, then we would have a sort of might makes right sense of things.
Oh, let's just capture all the women and perpetually impregnate them to spread our genes. But in our society, because we have intellect, morality is a result of intelligence and a capacity of reflection. Mm-hmm. And we've determined that, yes, perpetuating our species is important, but it's not the only thing that we care about. We care about not just survival. Mm-hmm. The animal kingdom and nature, most of nature just cares about surviving, and that's it. But we care about more than surviving. We care about thriving and being happy, eudaimonia, well-being, right? So that's why we can't say just nature, because we have other concerns.
Yeah, this is something I really liked about when reading Plato's Republic, because he kind of draws on this where, like, imagine a person as a city, and you have like all these kind of individualistic drives. Like you have the drive to eat, you have the drive to sleep, you have the drive to have sex. These are all kind of like their own pathways that they are going on. But the good is where you have all of these divergent pathways acting in tandem with each other, working towards some sort of like overall goal that benefits each of the components to yourself as a city in a way that is better than each, like being kind of this dichotomous person that is just driven by whatever passions they have in that exact moment, but rather you're using your intellect to kind of structuralize each of your passions in such a way that they will be fulfilled, but in a way that is not detrimental to themselves or detrimental to the others.
And it sort of brings into what Vervaeke talked about, the optimal grip. We can talk about the optimal grip here, and there's a lot of compromise. Like it's probably not in my best interest to get everything I want, or to live in a society where just everyone just caters to me and not to them, because that's gonna hurt me in the long run. It may seem like a short-term benefit, but it's going to be a long-term detriment, which is why we want to have, again, a mix between the individual and the group. When you have all these people who think, oh, I'm only an individualist, or I'm only collectivist. Well, let's be both. How about we say we need a balance, the optimal grip? And there probably is an optimal grip, but it's situational. And that's why it's not that morality is relative, but morality is contextual. The same action can be moral or not, depending on what happened. Killing a man is moral if it's in self-defense. It's immoral if it's a premeditated act of murder. The same action, striking someone with a hammer, can be moral or not, depending on the situation.
Or if it was accidental also as well.
Yeah, or playing video games. Playing video games is fine if it's if you're on a break and you want to have some fun. It may not be fine if you're addicted, and because of that, you're not meeting your other responsibilities, and you lose your job, and your whole life falls apart. It's everything is contextual.
Right. That was a good divergent discussion, and it wasn't even divergent really, but like actually drawing off of Diogenes and going further with it. That was really good.
So I know you want to talk about. So in this lecture, Vervaeke he's alluded to it in the past lectures, but in this one he puts his atheism right front and center, and he just declares in no uncertain terms that the weight of the scientific evidence is that consciousness seizes upon death, and that we don't move on. And he actually said it a lot stronger than I thought he would.
I know his direct quote is, "The evidence that your mind and consciousness is completely dependent and emergent from your brain is overwhelming." So brain death equals consciousness death, and he's saying the evidence is overwhelming for that.
and yeah, and I actually think I think it's very strong. I think it's not quite as I'm either an atheist or an agnostic, depending on how you want to say it. I say I don't think there's sufficient reliable evidence to believe a deity exists, but I also don't think there's sufficient reliable evidence to believe no deities exist. So while I have more in common, I guess, with the atheists in that I don't live my life as if there's a deity. I don't rule it out, and I'm open to sufficient reliable evidence that would change my mind. I think he's actually wrong. I think there's actually some. He's right that in a way there's overwhelming, but there's some not quite reliable evidence though that does leave open the possibility of more. So I think he's overstating it a little too much. He seemed a little bit defensive. Like I think, and maybe we were talking earlier. We think he doesn't have an audience, and I think maybe he had a hard time sort of delivering that line. I think he came across stronger than I've ever seen him in any of the previous lectures. And maybe he just felt, I don't know.
I think like, I understand why he kind of took on such a strong position, because like from that's almost like a framing for the whole purpose of this series is like taking that as fact. Here's where we have a meaning crisis going on. And so if he can present the case in which that is fact, because there's so much evidence for it, and then we're taking that for granted, if he can somehow resolve the meaning crisis without having to postulate the possibility for any afterlife or anything like that, then that would be kind of a success for him as building up the series.
No, I agree. I just think he stated it. It's funny. I'm the atheist, and you're the.
Well, no, I'm about to get into my disagreements in just a second, but
but he scientists don't prove things, right? So the science does not demonstrate there is no God. You can say the vast majority of the evidence is consistent with consciousness not surviving death, but there's some evidence. I mean, there is. I haven't in the last few years, but I spent several years diving into parapsychology, which I think none of it convinced me, but it convinced me enough that there was enough of the findings in parapsychology for me to say it's a worthwhile hypothesis to continue. Right. I think that there's methodological issues which I think they're probably not going to find it, but there's enough scientific evidence out there that leaves open the question that I think he was too strong. Sorry, go on.
Right. And I think for a lot of the people that actually are familiar with some of the like parapsychology and different things like that frustrates them is how disregarded the actual like experiments and things that they've done is. Like it's kind of completely ignored or strawmanned in such a way that is just like why do you even bother doing this? Like the whole some of my frustrations with like Michael Shermer and some of the other kind of more the skeptics, like what's the guy,
the big ass James Randi.
Yeah, James Randi. Yeah, like anybody that goes into that, like James Randi has a financial incentive in such a circumstance to make it so that the person is unable to follow through with whatever thing that they're trying to do. And like from some of the people that have actually interacted with James Randi have said that like he purposefully kind of tried to mess up the experiments and different things. And it's like,
I think that's I think here's the thing. A lot of people, especially skeptics and scientists, believe that just because they're educated in biases, they know all the logical fallacies, they understand the scientific method, they think that just because they understand this, they are therefore objective, which isn't the case. What they're forgetting is, or I think what they're mistaking it is, or not appreciating is, we are all biased, and these methods are designed to help us counter the biases. But if you're not actively applying these methods, then chances are you're falling prey to your own biases, because I don't think we can get rid of bias. We can train ourselves. We can use conscious cognitive ways. And if you do it often enough, it becomes more second nature, like anything. But so a lot of people, like I think the James Randis, they think because in certain times I'm doing an objective analysis, anytime I have a thought, it must be objective. And and it's not. So they become biased more against it, and they overstate what they should.
Right. And sometimes even it's like the nature of the axioms that they've accepted that are in order to do their scientific research is just what's getting in the way. So like Sam Harris, he has this like dichotomy. They're like either all actions are determined for reasons or they are determined for non-reasons. And like that's the only two options out there. Therefore, that leaves no room for free will. Like, oh, that's perfect. You just kind of like you set up a definition that makes it so that there's no such thing that free will could ever exist.
He probably said, did he say reasons, or did he say it's either determined or not determined? I think is
yeah. I mean, it's something like
either determined or random.
Right.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I don't know if we want to get too much into free will. I'll be honest. That's one of my biggest problems conceptualizing free will. I'm very open to it, but I have a hard time not seeing that as a dichotomy. Like that it's either determined or random, and so where's the room for free will? Now I'm open to coming up with a third prong, which is free, but I haven't been successful so far. I know Henry Stapp, who's a physicist, has sort of postulated, and he's written some papers where he's asserted free as the third prong, but he sort of, in my opinion, now I'm a layperson, but from what I understand, he just asserted it, and he just says it. Like, so but free will is a whole thing. Like we've talked about free will.
And you have people like John Searle, who's like, he's a philosopher of mind that talks about how like actions are determined by intentions, like which are necessarily existent within a mind. So like, mechanistically, your brain did things to send signals to your arm to pick up the bottle, but the reasons behind that have a mental quality to them. Like I'm drawing an example, so I'm going to pick up a bottle to elicit that example. But yeah, that's kind of.
And the question there would be why are we excluding the mental from the cause effect?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So like if you're saying everything is physically determined through
that,
but like within the physically determined things, unless you refer to intentionality as a physical process, I mean, like you could say it's like it's occurring within the mind, it's occurring within the brain, but it's still a mental component. So like you get people like Daniel Dennett, compatibilists.
I think some people say that I think, in my opinion, the mistake of thinking because it's mental, it must be free. Now, I think people mistake, we call it free will. Because we have will, it must be free. But no, it's free will, which leaves the alternative of unfree will. So it's not will in itself. I don't think we can just assume axiomatically is free. Now, my opinion, we'll have to have a whole separate conversation on this, which we have, which that I don't think it really matters in a practical sense. I think, but that's this is a long conversation that we probably don't want to.
And I think what most people mean by like free will is just the capacity to choose among options. And so like if like and being the originator of the choice, really, where like if say like I don't know, if given the option to choose between having sex with a man or having sex with a woman, then like sure your kind of like options are very much narrowed in some sense.
Now you're bringing it back.
Even with that, you don't have much free will. So I mean that's the one of the arguments Sam Harris made that I found pretty.
So if you wanted to like take you have your instinctive drives or to only be attractive to a certain type of to a certain sex and even like to narrow that even further to certain specific traits of the sex, then like I guess the case would be made that in the same way that you don't have the choice to choose between eating poison or eating donuts, you don't have the choice between eating fast food and eating healthy.
What I think, like, what we can say is like whether or not we have free will, the decisions are coming from us. It is our brains, it is our whatever system, our unit, which is making the intellectual analysis. Whether we technically call it free or not, It is us. I think people forget, or people also think only of free will as it's either coming from without, or if it's from within, it's free. But no, our within is part of the without. You know, our we're part of the system. We're part of this chain. So, but
Right.
I think people think, yeah. Go.
And I think, like, if we're taking determinism to be true, there are certain expectations that we might have. So, like, for all deterministic things, like gravity, or like inert objects like Newton's cradle, things like that, we can make predictions about like what they're going to do, and they're going to follow those predictions every single time given the right circumstances or environment for that. But I don't think, like, I haven't really been shown how that same predictive capacity can be done towards people at all. Like, can you make a prediction for what a person is going to do based upon your theory of determinism, and then they're going to follow through with it every single time?
Well, hold on. I mean, I think the fact, when it comes to people, honestly, we can often make general predictions that are often correct. It's not going to be every time, because I think the when you're predicting, like, okay, I throw a rock off a hill, I can do all the calculations to make the prediction. So I can know the size of the rock, the weight of the rock, the air pressure. Sure. I can determine this exactly. But when we're trying to figure out the calculations you make in a thought, in a series of thoughts, we don't have the information to make a precise thing. And again, there may be randomness in there too. But honestly, the reason psychology works, the reason that advertising works, the reason that propaganda works is because people are fairly predictable. That if we know certain things about people, we can, to a pretty high degree, figure out what they're going to do. Like, if I know certain things about you, I can make some pretty high percentage guesses as to what you, if I know you believe this, or this, I can make a pretty high percentage guess that you also believe that, and that. And I'm going to be wrong some of the time, but a large percent of the time, I'm probably going to be right. You know, if I know you're, I don't want to get into this.
Yeah, and I think you're probably right. Like, even the discussion is kind of so far abstract, and a lot of it is sort of based upon like certain axioms that cannot really be proven, that it is kind of loses a lot of its practicality. And that's kind of the thing also, like we brought up with Diogenes. Like, there, within any culture, there's always going to be kind of this dispersed these dispersed traits and temperaments among the population, so that you might have like a super rational person, like super rational person like I guess Epictetus, or one of the Stoics, or something like that. And then you maybe also somebody like Diogenes, who's just kind of this almost like raging, he's not a raging lunatic, but he's like this bum that he goes around publicly masturbating and different things like that.
Well, hold on, no. If it's true, the story of the masturbation, who knows? I mean, these are
a
this is what's been passed on. But it sounds like he did it. If he did it as a deliberate provocation, it's not just a crazy person. But I think he's an extremist. Which I think there's an irrationality to extremism. But the problem is, advocating against extremism always come, oh, you're just a centrist. You know, it sounds wishy-washy, and we have a gut instinct that wishy-washy or centrism is bad. You know, but I think if we use an analysis, if we stop and think about it, we can say, just because X is good in quantity Y doesn't mean it's good in quantity Y times 2 or 3 or 4.
Right. And it's funny because, like, I actually wanted to kind of bring this up in my simulation debate, but it went by so quickly that it didn't really have much time. I think there's an aspect where you can consider the purpose for a simulation, one, to maybe like test the individual within that process, like to see what they're going to do in certain circumstances. Another side is to see, like, okay, what type of, like, on the broader scale of, like, okay, you have a large group of people. What are the types of people that are going to emerge from that? And like, even if you, okay, so like the whole hawk and dove kind of situation, if you have a population with all doves, then what if you include like one hawk into that situation? Does that suddenly, is going off of game theory? And
you know what, I'm going to try to dig up, what thread was it in on Discord where Tyler linked that to me. he linked that simulation where it goes through
Oh,
where it
yeah.
shows
Yeah, I think it's called the evolution of trust. It's a really fun kind of game to kind of get a better understanding of game theory and like
I'm gonna try to Google
making
that and put
decisions.
that in the
Yeah, it's really good. But pointing out that like, okay, while you're measuring an individual in their circumstances, you're also measuring what is the group with that little individual there intruding itself onto that group. So like it's like you're measuring two things at once, where you're measuring like, okay, what is the society's capacity to deal with psychopaths, and also what is the normal person's capacity to interact in a psychopathic society. Kind of measuring both of those things at once. All right. Going back to Vervaeke and his strong usage of the, like, we have no, the evidence that your mind and consciousness is completely dependent upon your brain is overwhelming. I recently had watched this interview from Closer to Truth. He does a lot of great interviews with different people, and like trying to like I think you'd really enjoy his stuff, Pleasured Out, because like
I've seen a couple, of his, but it's been a while,
he has this one with Sam Parnia, who's a director of critical care and resuscitation.
I'm very familiar,
Okay,
in the Rare study,
He talks about how, like, okay, when the heart has stopped and there's no longer blood flow going to the brain, people have had conscious experiences that going on past that, and like knew the time that they like experienced death in some ways, and then able to be brought back like several minutes, maybe even longer after that. And if you were to be like watching the brain, like there's no functionality going on within that. So like,
we gotta be careful, but go on.
Well, at least nothing measurable. According to, like, it could be that there's some like hidden thing that can't be measured through MRIs and things like that. But it's still like, okay, if our assumption is that the function, like the brain functioning through blood flow and all that is what creates consciousness, then we would expect, at least given that hypothesis, that the stopping of blood through and the functioning of the brain would end consciousness for that moment. And like, there's other ways in which you can kind of like try to, like, if you wanted to create a story to fit that still within that hypothesis, you can, where like, okay, people say that they experience death, but it's only after their brain has kind of like been had blood flow going through it again, did they create a false memory?
There's so much in
which does happen.
I actually spent several years in a community, an online community where I did a pretty deep dive into parapsychology, and I'm very familiar with Parnia and a lot of the research. And for example, near-death experiences would be one of the reasons I would say I'm open to the possibility, though I think in the end, the evidence is probably still going to not support the consciousness surviving death, but there's enough there that it makes me think it's worth pursuing. But there's so much there. We should have like a stream where we just talk about, the science of near-death experiences. I could bone back up and get it all back in my head. There's so much. I mean, Sam Parnia, like right now, he has a study where that's going on. It's still probably going to be, I think, a year or two before any result, or maybe even a few years. It's really hard and slow research to do, where basically, just for anyone listening, what he does is he works with hospitals and in the cardiac care unit, where he's hidden some images up high over the heads of the hospital beds. And so the idea, well, he has multiple purposes. Part of it is just studying the process of death itself. So just from a clinical medical point of view. But one of the ideas is, if somebody reports an experience of being in a position above their bed, an out-of-body experience, where they would be in a position where they would have to, in their line of sight, see that image to see if they report seeing the image. In the first AWARE experiment, no one reported that, but to be fair, no one reported being in an out-of-body experience where they would have been in a position to have seen it. So we can't say, that it's disproved that hypothesis. and so he's doing a new version where I think they're tightening up the protocols and expanding it, but it'll take a while. But this is why I disagree with Vervaeke. If you just said the evidence is overwhelming that the brain produces consciousness, or at least in humans, because I'm a fan of integrated information theory, which could have consciousness beyond humans, but I would probably agree with that. But he made a statement that scientists don't tend to make, where this is just true. I don't remember his words, but I seem to remember he said something that almost on that line. We just know this. And science doesn't establish we just know this. It establishes there's a lot of evidence for this, but science always has to hold out the option that some other evidence could come along. And
or at least like science can at least say with certainty certain theories are false. Like given the expectations for this theory, this theory has been falsified, which I don't think has been falsified. And of course, like I know the other day I was arguing for the simulation hypothesis, and like that would be a theory in which kind of the physicalist assumptions of consciousness emerging from the brain could be true in some sense. So like if like we're the products of a algorithm that's being run that is based like, okay, so the algorithm runs the brain structure, and then that brain structure is kind of like emergent from that algorithm being run. But there's also the other aspect to the simulation hypothesis of the matrix, where like I'm inside of a brain in another world, but the brain that like I'm looking at this brain and it's showing all the correlations with the experiences, but those are all just kind of just things on the screen
and that's where I think the NDE, the near-death experience research, is at, where there are multiple hypotheses at this stage that I think is compatible with the evidence we have so far, with the reliable evidence anyway. I mean, the you know, like you said, well, we wouldn't expect this. Well, one option is we wouldn't expect there to be experiences in that situation. The other so it must prove consciousness survives death. The other option is, well, there are certain things we didn't understand what's going on in that experience, where we were just wrong with our. So the expectation is a hypothesis, but we can't use. And I hear a lot of people who are pro, and you know, it being like showing life after death, saying, well, because we wouldn't expect it according to neuroscience, this must be this. Well, no, it could mean there's stuff going on that we didn't realize were going on. And there are other experiments, for example, that have been done in rats. The problem is with humans, we generally can't implant electrodes deep into the brain stem, and we certainly don't do it within a heart attack. So you know, for example, there's studies with rats where they did do this, and they found a significant amount for up to, I think, a few minutes of activity in the brain after the head's been chopped, or not the head been chopped off, after cardiac arrest. That I don't know. This is completely anecdotal, but I used to have a Dell computer, and at the tip where you plug it into the computer, it had a blue light. And I was often amazed, like I often, unplug it and then bring it downstairs. So I would unplug it, and that blue light sometimes would last a few seconds, but once it lasted, I didn't time it because I didn't expect it, but it was well over 30 seconds, because I went like from all the way up to all the way down. Like it was a really long time, and that light was still running, but there was still some electricity for whatever reason. The electricity that had been coming in lasted, being pumped around that circuit for way longer than I would ever expect. And what I remember, we also have in NDEs, a lot of stuff is shutting down. So what you could, I think, potentially have is a lot of activity shutting down, but some activity for a short period of time may be increased. And there's these rat studies have shown a surge of coordinated electrical activity, like several seconds or 30 seconds to a minute or so after death, right? So there's so much. To me, the near-death experience research is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's premature. No matter what, it is useful, and it's telling us interesting things. But it's premature to say what it's telling us. The problem is there's not that much of it. There have not been all that many prospective studies. A lot of the research is retroactive and self-reported. Not Parnia's, but and even with Parnia, it's so hard to get to these guys right after the experience, interview them in a proper manner without leading questions.
Yeah.
It's really tough research, and I think people are going to have to be really patient, like to do it. Oh, sorry, Sumit, it's got to run. Thank you, Sumit. I know Sumit, by the way, everyone who's listening is here with a cold and a fever, so he's been a real trooper, and thank you, Sumit, for being part of it.
Yeah, thanks, Sumit. Yeah. Okay.
He said bye in chat.
Okay. So yeah, that's and like I said before, I understand why he's kind of coming out so strong on this position, because like that's kind of like his case for meaning past the meaning crisis would be much stronger if this is true. And like, so because of that, like in order to make his case as strong as it can, and I'm not saying that like as it is, it's currently up in the air. So like he's producing this series in such a way that this, if it does turn out to be true that like physicalism, like consciousness is completely emergent from the brain, then his like prescription to the meaning crisis can still be accessed. Whereas if he were to try to build up a like prescription to the meaning crisis, wherein this is kind of up in the air, or like if he's relying upon there being an afterlife, and then it turns out, oh no, you're wrong about that.
No. When I say he's being too far, listen, I'm with him that if I'm with him on his general conclusion that the evidence at this stage, the weight of the evidence to me is against it. There's some evidence that is not yet at a gold standard, like it's not super reliable, that could be against it. But I would say at this stage, and this is where I am, the evidence is not sufficient to believe in it. That's different than saying we know this, which he said, I think, in this lecture. Like, we know this is fact. And I think, listen, I'm not the religious one here. Maybe you're more religious, obviously, than I am. You could tell me, to me, it doesn't seem like there's anything in what he said, at least up till date, that someone who's religious couldn't use just as well as somebody who's not religious. So I don't know that first of all, you shouldn't, just because maybe even if it would help his cause, if it's not a rational, justified statement to make, he shouldn't make it. Because one thing I love about this series is up until now, he hasn't said something that I think is really just completely unjustified. He's been much more cautious.
Right. I think you're right. Like his project is aimed at both the religious and the non-religious alike. And he's trying to do something that can be helpful for both people in certain circumstances. Because like, as he brought up at the beginning of the series, like there's this kind of social distrust in our political systems, our societal systems, and like our religious systems as well. Like the meaning crisis is not only for those that find themselves to be like non-religiously affiliated. It's something that is pertinent to everybody in the Western world, I think, in a lot of sense. And so like, I think it's kind of interesting. Like he even like goes up against different aspects of Buddhism, where like I think at least within certain understandings of Buddhism is like consciousness is fundamental, and then like once you die, your ego dies, but you like return to the primary consciousness of, say, the universe or something like that. I'm kind of
that there's death and rebirth. Some Buddhists
that's true,
believe in death and rebirth, and and I think they believe that when you become enlightened, like a Buddha, that's the end of the cycle. So that once, like, so the Buddha would not have been reincarnated, but that most people are, and that's one of the objects is to break that cycle. But again, even what the Buddha said, as I understand it, is whether anything I've said is right or wrong. If I find out, if you find out it's wrong, just disregard what I said and go with what you said. So I'm like, if someone held a gun to my head and said, they say, you must choose a religion now to follow, I mean, I would, without hesitation to say, okay, I'm a Buddhist now. Like I'm a big fan of Buddhism overall, although I'm not a Buddhist. But
and I think there's a lot of benefits too, like to Buddhism, like that kind of tied in with Stoicism. Like there's the shared, I guess, axiom, or it's not even an axiom, just shared proposition between Buddhism and Stoicism. All are like all suffering is just a component to the mind. Like,
well, this is what I don't like. He said there was this big shift where these philosophers were now focused on reduction of suffering, but that was Buddha's whole deal. So I'm not sure why he thought the previous philosophers really weren't. It seems like Buddha that was his major focus. My guess is that like Vervaeke almost made. I was a little uncomfortable.
Maybe he's referring to like the Western philosophers, like within Western history, because there's kind of a strong separation between those two. Like it was, and I think more of his focus is probably more on like the Western history and like how we came to where we are and the meaning crisis in the West. Because
okay, it could be. Maybe he meant that you know. Yeah, I can go with that. I just, when I was listening to that, I mean, there was I was a little uncomfortable with a lot of. Oh, sorry. Did you have more in the atheism?
No. And in fact, if we want to kind of wrap up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you know, we can wrap up. I was just going to say I was a little uncomfortable with the way he described. He really painted the pre-Hellenistic Greek society as almost utopic, where they just had these small communities where everybody knew each other. And I just was thinking, okay, this sounds like sort of white ethno-state type talk. I don't know if you caught that when it was a little like my guess is, I haven't done this research, I don't know. My guess is the people during that time had just as much suffering. Like suffering is part of human condition, and it was just different suffering when they spread out. Like I'm sure, like spreading out through the Alexander the Great probably brought some. He talks at domicide, where you know the destruction of the home, but it brought a lot of great stuff too, I'm sure. So there were probably good things it brought a lot of civilization, technology, you know, agriculture, and all that kind of stuff too. So my guess is every generation thinks the last generation didn't suffer as much as them. And I have a feeling, like, my guess is the Greeks just had, like, Socrates was still dealing with suffering. Like, they were all focused on suffering. I think it's just I think it's a mistake to think that.
I think maybe he's focusing more like as the center for like their philosophy, like for Epicurus.
Well, they had more of a sense of agency arena because they knew everybody. Like if you grow up in a small town, but sometimes people want more than that. I think people in small towns often feel, at least today, that their agency arena is too narrow, that they want to see the greater world. You know, a whole new world.
Yeah, I mean, I've so far really benefited from his like I guess psychotechnology of his framing of like agent arena relationship and being able to kind of understand that, like, if you have a strong enough identity as an agent, then whatever new things that enter your arena can be handled and processed. Whereas if you're adopting an identity that is incompatible with the arena that you find yourself in, then that's going to kind of build up stress and damage your identity as a character.
And this is where, and this we can probably end on this last point, or on this last topic. This is where, and we talked about a few episodes ago, or a few times, where it brought up the notion of truth and does it matter, and the sense of, if you have a good sense, a non-distorted or like a comfortable sense of your agent arena relationship, you will have a great deal of well-being, whether or not you have accurately assessed the situation. So I may not agree with like different religions. Let's just accept all religions can't all be true in the same way. They can't all be true in the same way, but people have similar benefits in how they view their place in the world. So to some extent, I think just feeling like you have a good grip on your agency relationship gives you well-being, even if you're mistaken. in what you've done. Now, there may be where that's a problem is if it causes other problems, if it causes other activities that you cause harm to yourself or other people. But if somebody just has their sense of who they are and they're happy and they don't impose it on other people and don't have other things, I think they kind of won in a way. Like, they're okay. They have well-being.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too. Like in certain ways, you can see the shared patterns between religions. Where, like, say within the Christian frame, you might like all people are children of God, and so you must treat people as the children of God that they are. Within Buddhism, you might have a similar aspect of like all people are the manifestation of the Buddha within them, and so you must treat everyone as if they are that image of the Buddha. And like those, there's a difference in what those the propositional truth content to those, I guess, psychotechnologies, but there is still kind of a shared, I guess, practiced aspect to those two divergent beliefs that have to do like very much with the agent relationship. Like they're both different identities that you're adopting or acting as if, but they still have similar beneficial outcomes due to the arena that you find yourself within.
And I think, when you don't have what he calls modal confusion, you feel better, and that's well-being. And as long as it's not causing you other problems, that's meaning I'm okay. I'm not going to really try to talk somebody out of it who I may think is just wrong, but they just seem good and they're happy and they have well-being, things are good. Like I'm not too, I think, yes, I want truth as much as possible, but if somebody is just latched into something that makes them happy, that's pretty good. Sorry, Slam RN, welcome. Sorry, we had just said we're really wrapping up. Sorry, you're coming, as we're yes. That's Susan. Hey, Susan. Yeah. Sorry, we're wrapping up soon. But you're right. That a lot of it is about the loss of agency. We didn't talk too much about that, but there's a lot to talk about that. But
yeah. All right. Yeah, we can wrap up. Like, as I said at the beginning of the stream, I'm going to be interviewing Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy in just the next couple of hours. So if you want to join in on that and send in your questions during that stream, they'll be much appreciated, and I'll pass those on to him. But we've been part of the Bevry group. We have our links down below if you guys want to participate or join in. We've got our Discord, and we'll probably be doing more, I don't know, I guess specifically focused topic streams in the future. We'll figure that out on the back end. But thanks, Pleasure Doubt, for joining me, and also Submit. And I know Tyler was here for the before we even started. We had like a long kind of like internal discussion that was really good. But he had to be with his family, so
that was great. Thanks to everyone, and thanks to everyone who watched and commented, and like and subscribe.
Yes, exactly. All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye.